This is VikesNow, and it's March 10th. It will forever be known in infamy, so to speak, for the day that Adam Thielen left the Vikings after 10 years with the franchise. I'm here with our usual Wednesday guest, but today is Friday. We got good timing. Josh Frey, he is the editor of Purple PTSD. And right off the bat, sir, I'm going to ask you, were the releases of Eric Kendricks and Adam Thielen prudent, or were they premature?
I think the Adam Thielen one, especially, it definitely seemed like it was about that time. If they weren't able to get a deal done where he's taken less than a nearly $20 million cap hit, and he's going to be probably the wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, even maybe this year, if they, depending on what happens in the draft. So I think that one, especially, we kind of saw coming. The Eric Kendricks one kind of got to me a little bit, just because I still think that he's got a lot of football left in him. Didn't look great at times in 2022, but you take into account the fact that Ed Donatel just had him doing way too much in that defense, and I still think that he's definitely one of the bigger leaders that this team saw, especially on the defensive side of the ball. You're gonna have a tough time replacing that, but yeah, it's gonna be interesting. Offseason now in full throttle, so let's get into it.
Oh God, it is, and truer words are rarely spoken. So here's the deal on Thielen. It's funny that from the end of the offseason, whether it's him or his family says he's still got plenty left in the tank, the early front runner to land his services, the Kansas City Chiefs, and you can bet your ass he'll have stuff left in the tank if he goes to that receiving core that's already deficient of big name players besides Travis Kelce. Yeah, he'll prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt if he has, a future Hall of Famer throw into him. All right, here's what I asked you to do. Come up with a comprehensive list because free agency starts Monday in legal tampering. And we're going to go down the depth chart by position, and you're going to tell me players that could reasonably join the team. But to clarify, I do this with all my guests. Is this predictive that you think Adolfo Mensa will sign, or this is what you think is a good fit for the Vikings?
I think some of these guys on this list might be a little bit optimistic.
Okay.
So I think it's more of what I would want them to do, not necessarily what I think is necessarily going to happen. Because I think if once we get down this list, there's going to be like 2 or 3 guys where it's like you can sign one of these guys, but you're definitely not going to sign all of them. So,
yeah. The headline will be Josh Frey has 4 Pro Bowlers joining the Vikings in the offseason
exactly.
on a
Yeah.
budget that's about this big. All right. Well, yeah, if we get to ones that are kind of like Flores guys, you can say like I think they will actually sign him. All right. And then we'll have spots here. They're nothing burgers. The Vikings are pretty well stocked at offensive tackle, arguably quarterback and tight end. So we can gloss over those depending on what you want to say. All right. But at the top of the snake, quarterback, any free agents coming to the Vikings or nah?
Well, I think if I have to stay on brand here. I have to toss out my guy Gardner Minshew. I think that I do think that he could be a guy that you bring in, and even if Cousins doesn't get hurt or anything, like obviously he's been an Iron Man throughout his entire career. Knock on wood that stays that way. But I do think that bringing him in, he's a capable backup. We saw it last year in Philly. I also wouldn't necessarily mind just bringing back Nick Mullins because I think that he's pretty comparable to Minshew. Still a young guy, still got a lot of learning that he can do at the quarterback position. And if you go into potentially a bridge year with either one of those guys, I'd be happy. And then we talked about a couple guys in the draft too. So that I think there's a couple different directions that I can go with that position, but I think there's no really wrong answer here at this point.
Minnesota Minshew mania or Mullins
Exactly.
mania in Minnesota. All the triple M's. All right, so we got you down for Gardner Minshew. One, we won't do fullback because we don't even know if we're going to have one of those. We've already got a damn good one if we keep him in general. So we'll do running back. This one's interesting. So what say you?
I think a guy to keep an eye on here would be Jamal Williams out of Detroit.
Ooh,
It
that's
seems
new.
like he might be a guy that might stick around there just because he seems to fit that culture pretty well. But if he's looking to get potentially a little bit of a bigger deal elsewhere, I think Minnesota would be a pretty decent option for him. Who knows what's going to happen with Dalvin Cook? We might be looking at a situation where we're riding into 2023 with Ty Chandler, Kane Wong, who have had a combined like 30 touches over the course of their entire careers. So very inexperienced. He'd be a veteran that can just come in. He had his best season of his career last year, and he can at least take some of the snaps. And then that's again another position I'd be looking at in the draft too, between guys like Deuce Vaughn out of Kansas State. I think he's going to be really great prospect in the middle of rounds that somebody can pick up. But there's a lot of options that Minnesota can go there too. But I think Deuce Vaughn, Jamal Williams be my top 2 at this point.
All right, Jamal Williams on the free agent part of it. And if they roll into 2023 with just Ty Chandler, Kene Wangu, and some guy they drafted, it would kind of make sense because they ranked 30th in rush play percentage. So if you're not going to run the ball, then you might as well just kind of skimp at that position and get in with all the Super Bowl teams that never pay running backs in general. But Jamal Williams wouldn't shatter that, but he would make it so that you had a go-to guy who has a reputation rather than a bunch of what ifs in Chandler and Owangu. All right. Now, very apropos topic. Adam Thielen was released about 2 hours ago. And so now they either need a wide receiver two from promotion, KJ Osborne, Jalen Naylor, the draft, that's what this guy wants, or free agency. If it's free agency, who's it going to be?
I really hope that they don't do too much in free agency at the wide receiver position because, like you, I really think that round one of the draft, we're looking at wide receiver at this point. Especially that's pretty much confirmed now with Thielen out of there, and they want to get cheaper. So bringing in a wide receiver at free agency would pretty much just land them in the same sort of situation that they were in with Adam Thielen, I think. But a guy to keep an eye on, I've been saying his name since January, McCole Hardman out of Kansas City. I think that he's a deep threat that you can plug in next to Justin Jefferson. He's just a dynamic target. And like we talked about, I think it was just a few weeks ago, he had one of his better seasons going at least in the first half of 2022 before he got hurt. So I think that bringing him in, he's just a dynamic target and he can open up a lot of things for the offense.
And depending on his price tag, you could probably do both. Get him for however many million, sure, and then draft your guy, or get that. Who's the dude out of Houston you like? Nathaniel Dell?
Yeah, Tank Dell.
Tank Dell. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Well, his name is Nathaniel Dell, but I'm going to call him Tank Dell as long as that's his nickname. So
yeah, so you can do both if you get McCole because he doesn't scream WR2 damn it, but he can become one, and then you can also have him paired with whoever Kwesi Mensa likes at wide receiver. And then, by the way, KJ Osborne, and you got a nice little core there. All right, tight end isn't going to get too many headlines this offseason aside from a Hawkinson hopeful extension. Anything at tight end from you?
Yeah, I think honestly just run it back minus Irv Smith, I think is the best way to go about this. TJ Hawkinson, as long as he stays healthy, is going to be one of the better tight ends in the entire league. Can't ask for much more at that position other than that. And Johnny Munt's a solid backup. Ben Ellison, bring him back. I think you got a nice little trio there. Keep it going.
And same with, is that same speech applicable to tackle because they have Brian O'Neill and Christian Darrisaw?
Absolutely. You run those guys back if they're healthy, you got one of the best tackle tandems in the entire NFL. So keep ththose guys, bring back Oli Udoh, Blake Brandel, depending on his health as well. So yeah, you got a nice core there. I wouldn't mess with it too much.
At guard, you have three dudes who are under contract: Ezra Cleveland, Ed Ingram, second rounder, and Chris Reed, who is a somewhat expensive backup guard. Do you add anybody else?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one just because it really depends on what their faith is in Ed Ingram at this point in his career. He had a few up and down moments last year, which is to be expected from a rookie, but he did play all 17 games. So, I mean, if they didn't like him, you'd kind of expect that they would have tried to replace him at some point last season if they didn't have full trust in him going into the playoffs. But a guy that I'd keep an eye on would be Isaac Seumalo out of Philadelphia. He played over 1,000 snaps for them at right guard. So he'd be a guy that you can just plug in. If you don't necessarily think that Ed Ingram, he may take a step back. People have him on tape now. So if you don't have full trust in him, that'd be a starter that I go get. But other than that, I wouldn't do too much to mess with this spot either. Cause honestly, there's not a ton of options right now. And I wouldn't waste huge draft capital on an interior alignment in this draft either.
Oh yeah. We want to be done with those days. I wouldn't say Ingram was a waste last year. Not that you said that. But we already did the Bradbury in 2019, and it's time to be done spending all of these juicy picks on interior offensive linemen when all the other teams in the world can find them rounds 3 or below. All right, that is, I think, wrapping up the offense would be center if Garrett Bradbury walks.
Yeah, we talked about this guy a couple of weeks ago too, but Connor McGovern, New York Jets. I won't go into too much detail since we already talked about him, but yeah, he'd be the guy that if you don't want to bring back Bradbury, if you think that he's maybe reached his ceiling at this point as a Viking, he'd be a veteran guy you can plug and play. He's improved pretty much every single season that he's been in the NFL, and he's grown into probably a top half center in the league if you really break it down that way. So
And then also of note, Ben Jones was released about an hour ago by the Titans. I haven't
right.
done my homework on his bio yet, but it sounds like it was somewhat of a big deal. All right, so here's where the rubber hits the road because it's defense. The offense can probably, with an offensive-minded head coach and Kevin O'Connell, no matter what happens, be just fine, especially if Cousins and Jefferson are upright and healthy. But now this is defense, and this is what needs to be fixed because it ranked 27th via DVOA last year, 30th in points allowed, 31st in yards allowed. It's a miracle the team was 13-4. So Zadarius Smith out of nowhere says, "See ya," and the Vikings say, "What?" Edge rusher could be a need, whether it's the draft or free agency. We think Danielle Hunter will be extended. He can't be released or traded because the Vikings would lose cap space. A weird contract. Who is an edge rusher the Vikings could target in free agency, especially if Zadarius Smith leaves?
I think first and foremost, if you want to go get some veteran guys, Justin Houston, Frank Clark are two guys that come to mind right away. You could say that, hey, they might be paid a little bit too much, but I'd be a lot of the projections right now are the exact same as what Zadarius Smith is set to get from the Vikings in 2023. So especially if he does end up walking and you save about $12 million in cap space, might as well use that cap space to go get another veteran guy that you can pair with Danielle Hunter, because I think that this pass rush needs to be a lot better than it was, at least consistently, in 2022. So yeah, I wouldn't spend too much time focusing on this position in the draft either, just because you're probably not going to get a guy that you want in round one, and later on you're probably looking at more development guys, and they're going to take some time to bring this up to speed. So I'd go get a veteran in free agency at this position as well.
So a veteran with Patrick Jones, hopefully having a good summer. Maybe Luigi Villan finally effectuating the cool name, and then just roll with it and hope that the Flores blitz magic does the trick. Defensive tackle. I think we're under the assumption that Dalvin Tomlinson will probably return because they extended his negotiation deadline to bring him back. But what about defensive tackle? A spot that notoriously Vikings kind of say, oh well, at Jonathan Bullard's position.
Yeah, I mean, my best case scenario, I'd be looking at the New Orleans Saints right now, because they've got two guys that are heading into free agency that have been pretty solid for them over the past few years, David Onyemata and Shai Tuttle.
Oh, yeah.
I think Onyemata, especially, he's only 30. He's one of the better defensive tackles, at least as a pass rusher in the entire league. So you pair him with two veteran guys at the edge position, one of Danielle Hunter, or like maybe a Frank Clark. I think that's a ridiculous pass rush tandem that you got at the front there. And then, like you said, Brian Flores blitzes. You never know who he's going to bring at the safety position, linebackers. It could be a really fun year if they somehow land all three of those guys.
Off-ball linebacker, I think, is the most interesting. Because that's Brian Flores' niche, his specialty, his baby. Eric Kendricks just left. You have Brian Asamoah, who will be promoted, but then you got, what are you going to do here, fellas? Is it your guy, Trenton Simpson, or a free agent you're about to announce?
Yeah, I'm slowly coming off my Trenton Simpson train, I think, just because we talked about it earlier, wide receiver is probably that number one need at this point with Adam Thielen being out of there. And I still think, looking more and more into this off-ball linebacker class, I think you can get a solid guy in day two, whether it's a Jack Campbell at Iowa, Drew Sanders, Arkansas. And then they've been connected to a couple free agents at this position too. Zach Cunningham out of Tennessee comes to mind. And then I also think that David Long would be that's like best case scenario if they go after a guy in free agency, I think, because he can do pretty much everything that Eric Kendricks does, and he's younger than him. So
yeah, and he shouldn't cost quite as much as Tremaine Edmonds, 24-year-old Tremaine Edmonds. I mean, he'll be up there. David Long won't be like, 2 million. It'll be 10 plus, but it won't be, 17 that Tremaine Edmonds might fetch. All right, that's the one I'll instruct all Vikings fans to keep a particular close eye on, because Kendricks left, and that was probably the biggest weakness of the team. Somehow cornerbacks were decent, Patrick Peterson and Duke Shelley, but where all of the bane came from was the relative slowness from Jordan Hicks and Eric Kendricks. All right, so Zach Cunningham, yep.
I don't think that it should be just a given that Jordan Hicks sticks around either.
Yeah,
so we might be looking at two different starters in 2023 at that
spot.
Yeah,
so. I have friends from high school and then friends I've met along the way of this Vikings journey. They've been messaging me ad nauseum since Thielen's release, who's next. And when you look at the lay of the land, it seems like it should be Hicks. And I don't have that on good intel. That's just my personal theory. So I'm right there with you. All right, cornerbacks. This one is so damn fascinating because the Vikings have three youngish cornerbacks and Cameron Dantzler, Andrew Booth, and a Caleb Evans. So it'd be fine and dandy if they go draft Deontay Banks like everybody in the world is telling the Vikings to do. But they already have a bunch of young guys, and Deontay Banks will come in and be just, hopefully just like Booth. Hopefully he's good. And then you don't know if Patrick Peterson and Duke Shelley are coming back. So A, do you think those guys, those two will be back? And then B, if they do or don't, who is the one that will be targeted at cornerback?
I think if you're gonna target one of Patrick Peterson or Duke Shelley, you got to bring back Duke Shelley back over Peterson, just because I'm not going to trust Peterson at age 33, 34 at this point, 33. Where he's 33, where he's going to have another 5 interception season where he's one of the clutchest cornerbacks in the entire league. I think that was a bit of a flash in the pan. So I think you got to bring that Duke Shelley just because he's going to be cheaper and he's got youth on his side too, so he can continue to get better. But in terms of free agency, my number one free agent for the Vikings right now is Cam Sutton.
All right, it stays that way, huh?
It stays that way, yeah. I don't think that the Vikings can do much better than getting a guy in Cam Sutton who's locked down in the press coverage, exactly what Brian Flores loves in his defenses.
Co-workers.
Exactly, right. And then you get one of those young guys to pan out, and you got 2 solid starters there. I'd sneakily not be super convinced that Cam Dantzler is going to be a starter in this team either next year. So I think it's probably between maybe a Caleb Evans, Andrew Booth at that spot. So I'd keep an eye on that as well. But Cam Sutton all the way for cornerback.
Okay. Yeah, that one kind of, that little speech we just gave about David Long is Sutton will get paid, but it won't be James Bradbury money, or it won't be a Jalen Ramsey trade that you pull off and have to pay him. Darius Slay, by the way, all of a sudden is going to get traded, and that's probably another one the Vikings that would be tricky to afford unless they free up a bunch of money with a Cousins extension. But
And that kind of just makes it a little bit tougher for them to land a top corner in this draft too. Because if Darius Slay does go, James Bradbury in free agency too, Eagles are probably drafting a corner at number 10. You can probably book it at this point.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that fallout quite yet, probably because I was wrestling with the Thielen release. All right, I think this is the last one. It's safety, and they're pretty stocked there because Harrison Smith, we think, will be back. Cameron Bynum may or may not start. I don't hope he doesn't. I hope Lewis Seen starts like everybody else. But then at that spot, that's also where Flores could be versatile. That's why you see sometimes Brian Branch, that's his name, right?
Yep.
The rookie guy. That's why you see him mock drafted at times, the Vikings. And whenever I see that, I'm like, hey, fellas, we got safeties. We're good. But I guess in terms of that versatility, the way that they're raised now, they can also play linebacker in a sense. So any free agent safeties for the Vikings or not?
I wouldn't necessarily have this as my top spot in terms of free agency, just because they do have some depth there. But looking forward, Harrison Smith, age 35, I wouldn't trust him too much. Moving past 2023, maybe give him one more year, and then especially with that contract, he might be out the door too. And we really just have to see what happens with Lewis Seen too, because he's the biggest question mark on this entire roster right now. He could be either great, or he could just be another injury prone defensive back that is probably just that could just struggle throughout the rest of his career. But I do think that this is probably the most interesting position for this offseason for the Vikings, just because they could go in a number of different directions between running it back. I think they could find a guy day 2, day 3 at the safety spot. JL Skinner out of Boise State. He's probably not going to play too much this year because of his pec tear that he had just before the combine. But there's a number of different guys at that spot. Jamie Robinson out of Florida State comes to mind as well. But top free agent guy, I think if you want to go get a guy that can be a versatile defender in the secondary, can blitz, play a little bit of nickel corner, CJ Gardner-Johnson, Philadelphia Eagles again. Yeah. So he's going to be super expensive. So you're probably not going to land another huge free agent like a Cam Sutton or a David Long outside of that. But if you really want to go get the guy that can do a lot of things for you on defense in the secondary, he'd be the guy to go get.
Okay. Let's see. I had a train of thought there, but now I can't remember. It was something about Harrison Smith, but now I'm drawing a blank. That's a first for this show. How much do you think Gardner Johnson would cost?
Oh, it'll be probably 10, 12 million, something like that. So it'd probably be a hefty deal. I know I had the Spotrac projection. Spotrac's projecting him to be 13.3 million annually. So it'd be a pretty penny for him, but he does do a lot of stuff. He had 5 interceptions last year. He played a lot of nickel for the Eagles, which people didn't necessarily think he was going to be able to do. So that's a little interesting wrinkle there as well.
Okay. All right. So the next time we'll chat, it'll be right. It'll be like a couple hours before formal free agency begins. We'll already have tons of legal tampering hints. But by the time you and I converse on VikesNow, we will either have no decision on Kirk Cousins' contract, which means they're probably letting it ride out in 2023. We'll have a dinker extension of an extra year or so, or we'll have, I guess, what you call long-term 2 or 3 more years. What do you think next Wednesday you and I are talking about regarding Kirk Cousins' contract?
I think we're talking about they're playing it out in 2023. If you look at the number of veterans that they're letting go already this offseason between Thielen, Kendricks, who knows what happens with Harrison Smith, Zadarius Smith. I think that they're really focusing on bringing more youth and cheaper youth to this roster. So I wouldn't expect a huge deal to get done unless for whatever reason he decides he wants to play for $25 million,
Yeah.
then he can easily go out on the open market and you get 40 from a team.
I'm
So if that happens, then I think that he's sticking there long term. But if not, I think he's out of here after 2023.
Okay, I'm glad you said that because that's the thing I drew a blank on. Out of all of the current gentlemen on the roster, including Kirk Cousins, I even did a show about how Kirk Cousins isn't going to take a pay cut. If there are players that will take a pay cut, I believe the one guy would be Harrison Smith, and that would
Yeah.
be just to stay with the Vikings. Now, I don't have it on good authority that he will, but I will say that if any Vikings player takes a bona fide pay cut, I'm not talking about restructuring and void deals, board years and stuff. I'm talking about an actual pay cut. It will be Harrison Smith. We shall see. All right, sir. You have a busy week afoot, as do I. And we'll talk next Wednesday at our usual slot to start to look more at the puzzle. We'll have more Vikings released, perhaps a trade, and then with any luck, 1 or 2 new free agents to digest. All right.
Sounds great to me, man. Have a good weekend.
All right. Take it easy. Later.